Hello, Intro to Stats class. Today we are going to learn about behavioral and social experiments in relation with data ethics. So for this one, we did last time about experiments where clinical trials were involved that could be risky if it is not done properly or with the consent of the subjects. But here we're going to discover what if we're conducting an experiment in behavioral and social sciences. Then we see that the risks involved in these kind of experiments, they're acute, not that severe, and not that much beneficial also for future purpose, but there are some kind of problems involved. All right, so here they're talking about a very famous experiment in page number 3, on page number 184, the example 3.24. They talk about uh, Stanley Milligram of Yale. He was a PhD student, and he conducted an experiment. The social psychologist Stanley, he researched the effect of authority on obedience, and he concluded people either obey either out of fear or out of desire to appear cooperative, and even when acting against their own better judgment and desire. So his experiment is very controversial experiment. So it is basically to see if a person will perform acts under group pressure that he would not have performed in absence of social inducement. So he has experiment basically was learning about effect of group pressure and the person's original reaction towards some particular situation. So here what they have done, in that case they just tested a subject, but with that subject they had three others. All right, three other subjects, they were unknown to the original one, and the three others were the Confederates. They were kind of just trying to manipulate the experiment. So experimenter explains that he's going to study the what is the effect of the punishment on learning going to be there. So they had two kind of groups. One is the learner, the one who were confederated, they were doing acting, they knew what they're supposed how they're supposed to behave, and they were strapped into an electric chair, and on that and the subject was the who subject became the teacher, and for the confederator, the learner, they had been strapped to the electric chair, and the chair, it has different severity of shocks over there. So it was basically between 150 to sorry, it's not 150, it is 15 to 450 volts. The shock levels were there, and then they were categorized as slight shock or the to the severe shock. But here there were different intensity levels: slight shock, moderate, and then strong, very strong, intense, extremely intense, and then next to other very dangerous or extreme level of uh, shock. Then, and it was all a setup, and the experimenter said that he's going to take the responsibility whatever happens to the learner. So, and the purpose of this is to check how the punishment affects the learning. So all is rigged here, and what happened, each time the subject asks some question to the learner, and if it is wrong, then the subject has to, means the teacher has to increase the intensity of the shock every time that is wrong. So out of 30 out of 40 trials, just 30 were incorrect. So the teacher confederates call for a higher shock level at each failure. So with the subject, there were other teacher confederates, other participants who were each time very easily increasing the shock level. And on the other side, for the learner, keep in mind, here in this setup, the teacher and learner, they were sitting in two different rooms. Teacher can't see the learner but can hear the learner. So every time the learner responds, that gives the answer, teacher can hear it. And after increasing the shock, if it is an incorrect answer, the teacher can hear the response or reaction. So what happens each time, as gradually the shock level increases, the learner uh, protests, and they ask to be let out, they shouts, they complains of heart trouble, and finally screams in pain. So shocks were phony because they were participant, they did it just to check. So they were an actor, it was not an actual shock. So but the subject didn't knew. So they kept on increasing, and the the experimenter kept on pressurizing the mm, uh, teacher, the subject, to keep on going, and other two teachers, they also pressurized the subject teacher to keep on increasing the punishment. So what happened, the while the experiment yields wild variation in performance, some uh, some of the subjects, they said that they readily applied pressure, they readily to pressure applied to them by the confederate, means they basically increase the level of uh, volts, the shock, because they were pressurized by the peer teachers. So this was conducted on different a lot of different participants, and the finding was that a lot of were subjected to the peer pressure, the subjects, the teacher, and they wouldn't have done this increment of shock level if they wouldn't have been in the peer pressure, means the pressure of other confederate teachers. So you can check that the detail about this experiment on stanleymilgram.com. And basically, in this experiment, the subject was de-hoaxed carefully and had a friendly reconciliation with the victim. So, actually, it was acceptable by that time when he did his work, but now this kind of study, we call it unethical, because that's not ethical. The subject didn't knew, and he was in a trauma, he was such in a pressure while increasing the shock, he may not have done it. He must be concerned about the life of the participant, of the learner, that he is increasing the shock, the participant may die, or it can hurt in some way. So but when we can so when you look at this thing, so Milligram's experiment, it illustrates some difficulties facing who plan to review behavioral studies. So basically, when we do the behavioral studies, there is no risk of physical harm is involved. But if no physical harm, because it's about behavioral study, social study, then what happens, it includes some risk, embarrassment, and some emotional effects, maybe that something may harmful for the subject. uh, so physical harm is not that likely, but there could be a emotional harm, or it could be invasion of privacy or undignified situation, which the subject is not comfortable with it, and be may not have done if he or she would have known that he's going to be subject of this study. So other thing, now in the previous section we talked about, whenever we conduct an experiment, clinical trial, we always talk about consent. But many behavioral they face a trouble that they think if they in advance take the consent about the experiment that I'm going to do, so do this and that, then the subject will already understand that this is this kind of setup, and his or her behavior could accordingly change, or the behavior won't be the natural one. So that way it's something very hard for the experimenter. If they tell it, then it means to have the consent, they have to tell it, and if they don't tell it, then it's against the ethic that they don't inform the participants what's going on. So the ethical principles of American Psychological Association require consent unless study merely observes behavior. If it is just about observation, they just say, okay, you observe. Otherwise, you have to take a consent from the subjects. All right. So we're going to talk about another example here, where we talk about basic requirement for informed consent in medicine and psychology. So let's have a look at this example. That's about domestic violence and what it is. For domestic violence, uh, police, the researcher, they were trying to find out what should be the best way to respond to domestic violence calls. Means what should be they doing if they get a call for that. So what they did, usually the practice was that they used to remove the offender, and they just, whoever the criminal is, and they just calm down the other people living in home who are being a victim. And depending on they used to do, depending on the crime situation, they used to do the arrest. But if usually it's not that violent, and the victim, usually they don't, they just hesitate to press charges. They rarely press charges against the criminal or the person living with the victim. So, and in that group, especially the women, so they don't file some kind of complaint or charges against the criminal or the other person, family member. So they uh, they just don't have any kind of arrest in that case. So if it is no arrest, maybe the same kind of behavior from um, the offender may happen again. It can reoccur in future. So here the researcher thought about what should they do so that this kind of this kind of chain of offense by the offender should stop. So basically, a typical domestic violence experiment, it compares. So they did a kind of experiment where they had two treatments. So those two treatments, they wanted to check whether if they make an arrest, or if they just hold him overnight or warn the suspect and release. So they were thinking about whether if arresting is good, or whether just giving a warning or holding the person overnight and then releasing the person. So what they did, how they conducted that experiment. For the experiment, they, whenever they got a call, they went to the scene, and then they're just observed, evaluated the whole situation. If it has some kind of very severe situation, if it has death threats, so arrest was necessary. But if it is not that serious, then what they used to do, they used to call the headquarters through radios, and then they get an instruction. So other side on the police headquarters, they a person used to be on duty who used to open an envelope. An envelope has already pre-written consequences, that whether it should be hold overnight, or should be arrested. So a random order of punishments. So according to that, uh, and that list was created by statisticians. So according to that whatever is written for particular case, the police used to either arrest or suspect or warn the and release him or her, whoever the person, whoever was the offender. So in that case, what they have seen that in this kind of experiment, um, that are when they figured out arresting domestic violence suspect, yes, it has a positive impact. It reduces the future violent behavior. So because of that, now arrest has common um, police response to domestic violence. But here now again, because they were a part of a study, now they think that whether it should be ethical or not. So for this one, because here if someone is already committing a crime, so based on the phone call a person, then he should be arrested. So there should be no trouble not taking the consent of the people involved in this research in advance. I hope you get it, and we'll be doing after this. We're moving to next chapter. Thank you for listening. Stay healthy.